Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones. I note with sadness the death of our friend Roger Ward, who was the chief curator of the Mississippi Museum of Art in 2019 when he gave an excellent History's Lunch presentation on silhouette artists in antebellum Mississippi. He had moved to the Kansas City area a few years ago and died earlier this month. Don't forget there is time to reserve your free ticket for tomorrow evening's screening of The Harvest at 6 p.m. here in this auditorium. Directed by Sam Pollard and Douglas Blackman, the documentary tells the story of the fight to integrate schools in Leland. A Q&A with Douglas Blackman will follow the screening, and you can check the Mississippi Humanities Council website for more information and how to reserve your tickets. And then there'll be free admission to these museums this Friday to celebrate the birthday of our own Hezekiah Watkins, who will speak at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. about his experiences as the youngest Freedom Rider. So come take advantage of that Friday. If you have picked up a schedule over the last few weeks, you'll see that Bobby Smith was scheduled for next week, but he had needed to rain check that program, and we have prevailed on our friend and the Civil War historian Jim Woodrick to take that slot. He'll present Raiding on the M&O Railroad, which is an examination of Grierson's winter raid of 1864-65. Today, I am delighted to welcome Ethel Morgan Smith, who will be presenting Constance Curry, The Art of Activism. Ethel Morgan Smith is Professor Emerita at West Virginia University, where she taught literature and creative writing. She earned her BA in Business Administration from Alabama A&M University and her MA in English and Creative Writing from Hollins University. Smith has received a Fulbright Scholarship to the Universität of Tübingen in Germany, a Rockefeller Fellowship in Bellagio, Italy, and 2 NEH Fellowships, and was a visiting artist at the American Academy Rome and a DuPont Fellow at Randolph-Macon College, among others. Her new book is Path to Grace, Reimagining the Civil Rights Movement, just out from the University Press of Mississippi. Did you say today is the first time you've seen hard copies of the book? She is also the author of From Whence Cometh My Help, the African American Community at Hollins College, and Reflections of the Other, Being Black in Germany. Help me welcome Ethel Morgan Smith.
Thank you. Oh, I can hear myself. Thank you very much. I am just thrilled to be here. So I'd like to thank the museum and Chris, and I'd like to thank the University Press of Mississippi, and I'd like to thank all of my future friends here. So thank you very much. So one of the things I do sometimes before I do a talk, I try to tell a little joke. And, and you have to be careful about this, but I think we're a group of Southerners, so I think we will get this. So I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and I used to take these classes at Emory University. This is before I went to graduate school. I was 37 years old when I went to graduate school. So I used to take these classes. It was called Evening at Emory, and it was literature classes, but they were all male. You know, they were full of, and it was a lot of guys in the class. They were full of Hemingway and Updike, and it was fine with me because I didn't know those writers, right? So one day, a woman came to teach the class, and she was a tall woman, and she had just won some award at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. So one of the guys raised his hand and said, "Why is it that all the Southerns are always winning these awards?" So she stood over him and said, "Let me tell you something. We in the South may not know how to read, but we sure as hell can write." And I thought, I want to be like her. And then she taught the Flannery O'Connor story, "A Good Man is Hard to Find." So one of the guys go, "Well, women can write about killing." You know, it was just the funniest thing. But it was Connie Curry, so I'm getting back to Connie, who said to me one day, "Ethel, you have taken all the evening at Emory classes. It is time that you go to graduate school. So thus is how I went to graduate school at Hollins. But I love that. But that whole idea about we in the South, it opened another door for me in terms of, I grew up being Black in the South, and you were told to get out as soon as you could and that kind of thing. But when she said that, it reminded me that the South belonged to me too. That it's a chaotic, history is chaotic, it's messy, it's beautiful, it's ugly, it's all of those things. But what it is, it belongs to all of us. And wherever I go in this world, and I've been to a lot of places, my DNA is in the Black Belt of Alabama. So anyway, but I love that. I couldn't, those guys would just, when Jesus, we may not know how to read, but we sure as hell can write. So anyway, so let's see if we can keep that tradition going. So thank you again for inviting me. And I think that, so I'm going, in writing, when you write about people, you use their last name. But since Connie is our friend, I'm going to call her Connie rather than Curry. That seems very distant kind of thing. So I may make a mistake sometimes when I'm reading and say that. So just keep that in mind. So glasses on. I do believe that spirits are with us, and I think that I've befriended Connie's sister, Ann, in Savannah. And we have spent so much time, talking about Connie, talking about stories, and we share stories together. And she was just so beloved. There was nothing phony about her. Whenever she loved something, and she loved most people, but more than anything, she loved the work that she was doing for the civil rights movement, and for not just the civil rights movement, but for our country, making our country a bigger and better place for all. So what I'll do, I'll read some, and then I'll stop and talk a little bit. And sometimes when I wrote these chapters, I will go back and forth. I may mention something and then don't come back to it for a while because I connect it to something. So, okay, so here we go. I hardly remember a time when Connie wasn't in my life, just like so many other people. She was at the epicenter of the civil rights movement in Mississippi during the violent days of the 1960s. Today, she exposes how that state's education system is mostly a pipeline to prison for Black boys. A second-generation Irish immigrant who was raised in the South. Connie spent her lifetime writing about the heroes in the margins of the struggle. She gave voice to folks whose words have been muffled and lost in the noise of history. That is her legacy, her gift to so many of us, especially me. So, she's damn funny too. That's what Julian Bond said about Connie. They were best friends for a very long time. I think when they first met, Connie was maybe 19 and he maybe was 25, and they just became these bosom buddies. Anyway, one day he called her and said, "For your birthday, I think I'm going to give you a class, and we're going to together go to a comedy class and learn how to be even funnier than we are." So anyway, he was her long lifetime friend. When I saw Connie to do this interview, she had lost so many friends, and she was depressed. Her 20-year-old cat had died, and then she had lost her house in Hunted, South Carolina, where we all gathered often. And she was depressed. So she said, "I'm so glad you came. This cheers me up a lot." And we just sat all day. We talked about people, and we talked about places. We talked about time. So Julian Bond, whom we lost, and then Connie, we lost her 5 years later. But they were bosom buddies. So Connie said to me, "I've been telling jokes all my life since I was little. Folks have always known about my filthy mouth, okay? And Connie and I would laugh, and too remembered some of the joke skills. I always remember spending many lovely days and nights at her beloved beach house. So did so many other people. Everybody from Pat Conroy, John Lewis, Julian Bond, Andy Young, Maynard Jackson, Lita Fitzgerald, Vivian Malone-Jones, Dorothy Bowden, and other dignitary and artists. There was always some activity happening at Connie's house. There was always cookouts, potluck suppers, ad hoc committees, thinking about the next urgent issue that we needed to deal with. She kept a log at the beach house where you didn't just sign in, but you wrote about your experience on the island. Just reading the log was entertaining. I had a dream one time that one day the two of us would take that log and write it and make a book out of it. Of course, that didn't happen. But the brisk autumn morning, I saw Connie. I interviewed her at her house on Myrtle Street in Atlanta, Georgia. It looked the same as I remembered more than 40 years earlier. I choked up a bit with gratitude for the memories. She was mourning the loss of her beloved beach house, artists and artist colony during a hurricane. She was also organizing her files to begin writing her memoir. Her story is remarkable, and she had lost her cat of 21 years. And we all had the same cat. So her cat was, we all had, so our friend Donna Matern, Ethel Smith, and Connie. So Connie had the first cat, and named Mr. Fickles, I guess. And so then we had another one, and we always called him Fickles 1, Fickles 2. You know, we never actually really knew their real names. But anyway, so we loved those cats. And mine lived to be 18, so they had long lives. I don't know what happened to Donna Matern's cat. She may have given it away or something. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was one of the major civil rights organizations of the 1960s, and Connie Curry was the first white woman appointed to the executive board, founded by Julian Bond. It emerged from the first wave of student sit-ins formed in April 1960, meeting organized by Ella Baker at Shaw University in North Carolina. After its involvement with the Voters Education Project, SNCC grew into a larger organization with many supporters, and mostly supported financially by people from the North or people in the South who had money and who cared about the movement. Often becoming targets of racial violence and policy brutality, SNCC played a huge role in the freedom rides and the marches on Washington, Mississippi Freedom Summer, the Selma Campaign, the March Against Fear, and other historic events. SNCC's major contribution was in its field work, organizing voters' registration, freedom schools, and direct action all over the country, especially in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Connie went to Mississippi that summer, 1964, with SNCC workers. It was called Freedom Summer, or the Mississippi Summer Project, where volunteers attempted to register many African American voters, as many as possible in the state. The violence that summer was horrifying. We were all scared, but we knew we had to continue our work, Connie told me. 4 years later, Connie still received threatening phone calls. After one meeting, she returned to her Atlanta apartment to find her Volkswagen with KKK painted all over it. She was afraid that school desegregation would blow their work apart. That is how Connie started traveling as the Southern Field Secretary. This was after 1964 decision that mandated if the organizations was going to receive federal funds under Title VI, they had to come up with a desegregation plan. Many school districts came up with what was called the freedom of choice, which stated that students could choose to go to any school in their district. But those deep South, Southerners, those deep South districts knew that the sharecroppers were dependent on white plantation owners, and they weren't going to deviate. In 1965, Connie met a woman from around here, Mayor Bertha Carter. Maybe some of you know the Carter family. Anyway, 53 families had signed up to integrate, but by the opening of school that year, they all had withdrawn because they were threatened with eviction, job losses, bodily harm, and the Klan had shot into the Carters' home. When Connie and other field workers learned that Maybertha and Matthew had enrolled 8 of their children in the then white school, they went to visit them immediately. Connie and the other field workers were there to make sure the transition was as smooth as possible. All of the field workers were white women because they posed less of a threat to the lawmakers. By then, Maybertha had left her husband, not left him to leave him, but left him to do some work, okay? Left her husband, Matthew, in Jackson with the children, and had moved to Atlanta to try to earn a living because all the jobs had dried up for them because of their work in the civil rights movement. She was working for the Georgia Council on Human Relations. Then she began to work at the American Friends Service Committee, where Connie worked. Connie worked there for 10 years until they lost their grant. She then returned to Atlanta and started working for the city government under Maynard Jackson, the city's first African-American mayor. She received a call about a conference called Women in the Civil Rights Movement, sponsored by Georgia State University and the Martin Luther King Center. There she saw Maybertha across the room. They had not seen each other in 13 years. Her husband Matthew had passed. Curry described him as a wonderful man. He sewed and made underpants for his little girls. He would help them bathe. He was always there for them. Maybertha told me all of their children, I'm quoting Connie here, had graduated from the then white high school, and 7 had graduated from Ole Miss. I've got to write that amazing story, Connie kept telling herself. She told us that on the way home. I've got to do this. This has to be written. That was her first book, Civil Rights Started. Later, it influenced the documentary. Connie researched and produced on her own. The Carters used the Freedom of Choice plan to enroll the youngest 8 of their 13 children in the public school in Sunflower County, 9 miles from Drew, Mississippi, in the fall of 1965. Even though the Carter family lived closer to Drew, the family had done most of their shopping and church going in Marigot and Cleveland, Mississippi, like other Black citizens in the area. The plan was designated by Drew's school board to put districts in compliance of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Given the racist attitudes, Blacks were not expected to choose white schools. The Carter family saw it differently. Connie's moving documentary shows the Carter family's commitment to obtaining a quality education in context by examining the conditions of segregation prior to 1965. The family faced many hardships. It was much more complicated than them just going to school there. Getting fired from jobs, bodily harm, and anything that could be taken away from them was taken away. White resistance was massive, which led to Connie's latest term. When I interviewed her that day, she used the term called resegregation. She said, this is where we are now. We've had segregation, integration, now we have resegregation. In the epilogue of the film poses the dilemma of education versus incarceration, a particular threat to young black youth. While the town of Drew is geographically isolated, the patterns of segregation, desegregation, and resegregation are increasingly apparent, not just in Mississippi, but throughout the public education system in the United States of America. On that first day of school in 1965, the Carter's family's dream of getting freedom seemed to be coming true, but they were not ready for the consequences. We witnessed the family's struggle against society and the conflict that resulted from the choice to go against society by doing what was right and what belonged to them. The Carter family did not get support from many organizations that was trying to support racial equality. The Carter family ran into many conflicts and challenges, but they overcame them all, stepping over the color line that many others refused to cross because they were simply afraid. They had too much to lose. They and their children could have been killed, and nothing would have happened to the terrorists. After Matthew Carter regained his job, he became ill, and he died a few years later from a heart attack. So that was her first book, and it was for first, yes, civil rights. And I remember when I received a copy of it, just so happy that she had done it. So Aaron Henry was the head of the NAACP in Mississippi for 35 years. Connie knew him from the time she was a field worker in Clarksdale. She frequented his drugstore, and they became good friends. One day he called me, he said, a lot of people have wanted to write my memoir, but he wanted me to do it, Connie said. I was so flattered. I was so honored. So I'll tell you a little bit about him. Aaron Henry was born in Dublin, Mississippi in 1922. His parents, Ed and Mattie Henry, were sharecroppers. While growing up, he worked on the flowers plantation 20 miles east of Clarksdale. He hated everything about growing cotton because of the hardships that it had on African Americans working on the plantation. His parents, like the Carter's family, believed education was essential for the future of him. So he was saving his money to go to school. After high school, he worked at a hotel, a motel it was called, as a night clerk to earn enough money for college. But instead of going to college, he changed his mind. He enlisted in the Army. Those 3 years taught him that racial discrimination and segregation was common all over the country, just different. He described his experience in the Robert Penn One's book, Who Speaks for the Negro? But at the same time, it confirmed his feelings that segregation was worse in his home state. He decided that he would work for equality and justice for Black Americans. When he returned home after World War II in 1946, he found a progressive voters' league that had been formed to work in the implications of the 1944 Supreme Court decision abolishing white primacy. As a veteran, Henry was interested in Mississippi and exempted returning veterans from paying the poll tax that was imposed upon them. Under the poll tax law, a person had to have paid his poll taxes for 2 years prior to the time he or she voted. He tried to get Black Mississippians to go down to the courthouse and register to vote. When Henry went to the circuit court's office to register, he was rejected, as other Blacks had been before him. The clerk asked him to bring a certificate. After he brought the certificate, the clerk informed him that he still needed to pass various tests to show that he was qualified to vote. He finally registered to vote after he read several sections of the state constitution and passed the test. He used his GI Bill to enroll in pharmacy school at Xavier University in New Orleans. After graduating in 1950 with a pharmaceutical degree, he married Noel Michael and went into his own business. As a businessman in Clarksdale, he became involved with the local civil rights activities, especially around African Americans' voter registration. He organized the NAACP branch in Clarksdale, mainly because of the incident where two white men who were subsequently found not guilty of raping two black young women. In 1959, Henry was elected president of the NAACP. He became a close friend of Medgar Evers, who worked as the secretary for the NAACP in 1950. On June 12, 1963, Mr. Evers, of course, was assassinated in his driveway in Jackson, Mississippi, and we know that story. Aaron's book became Aaron Henry, The Fire Ever Burning, written by Constance Curry, and she wrote this from his papers. The book was published 3 years after he had died in 1997. And I know what that feels like a little bit. I went to school, graduate school at Hollins University, and there was a community who had been enslaved, but not just slave, working in the fields and that kind of thing, but enslaved as terms of working for the college. So there was a difference there. But it was just such an important contribution to the civil rights movement and to Americans everywhere. So Henry helped to secure the Head Start program for Mississippi and risked his life so that all Mississippians could enjoy the rights guaranteed under the U.S. Constitution. Although his name is not familiar as Martin Luther King Jr., as Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, or other icons of the civil rights movement, his role was just as important. He did a lot of behind-the-scenes work and also helped financially. And Connie and I agreed with that we were interested in those people that you never heard about. So the people at Hollins College, there was only one person. So they had their own church, and they were in the back door of the college so that young children could take the path and come to work, and if they needed their parents. Connie continued to work on how the Mississippi education system for black children, especially black boys, was a pipeline to the prison system. For someone who was never set foot in a courthouse, her impact on giving voice to people whose voices were muffled and lost in the noise of whitewashing history with racism. Her contribution to the cause of civil rights is monumental. Her next book was Mississippi Harmony, Memoirs of a Freedom Fighter, combines her historical analysis and the proud voice of these two sisters, the Hudson sisters. They were among the unsung women of the civil rights movement. And that was an issue that Connie and I talked about all the time, that there were not women in the forefront. People would say, oh, there's Rosa Parks, but there were so many other women who were in the forefront, like these sisters, for an example. Winston and Dobie Hudson, fearless sisters, were finally able to vote in 1962, which inspired other blacks in violent-prone areas to vote too. On the back of the book, Pulitzer Prize author and civil rights activist Alice Walker wrote this: "How is the tender, unshakable love that we have for our people kept us alive and have kept life in us? Through the music, yes, but even more profoundly, I believe through the stories of a well historic lives, live full tilt in the face of some of the worst times human beings have ever known. Lives like those of Winston Hudson and her sister, This precious book reveals some of whom we mean, what we mean when we say we are so proudly, but yet we are humble. With Connie editing the Hudson's book's life, a template for the broad social change in the Deep South, I am sure there are countless Winston and Dovey Hudsons who were never sought to share the national spotlight. But it was through women like these that the day-to-day change was achieved. And we also have to remember that there were men who were in charge of the Black organizations during that time. So, like I said earlier, there wasn't much room for women except to do typical women things: answer the phone, cook, get food, do typing, the same kinds of things. With Connie's editing, Hudson's life became a template for the broad scale of social change in the Deep South. I am sure there are countless of these women. Connie always said, she kept repeating that, but they didn't, because they were women, which was another issue in the civil rights movement, the issue of gender. They did not make it to the front line. The book tells stories about how segregation policies of Strong Thurmond, Trent Locke, and Jim Crow were more than just a set of annoying rules. That's what Trent Locke described Jim Crow. For the Black community of Harmony, Mississippi to simply survive there, these injustices would be admirable story admirable story itself. The sisters were able to rise above and end many of the wrongs. These women are some of the unheld heroes who literally risked their lives, jobs, and homes to fight the national civil rights effort on a local level. The book shows us that segregation is like a smog that chokes the most mundane of human efforts: feeding your family, educating your children, and worshiping your God. When I received an autographed copy of Deep in Our Hearts, and I have those books over there, Connie autographed those books, and this is what and my book, From Whence Cometh My Help, about the African American community at Hollins College, had recently been published. So Connie writes to me, she says, "For you, Ethel, who would have ever dreamed we'd do books? Congratulations, my friend. Love always, Connie." October 2000. Those were my sentiments exactly. It took me back to all those years when us doing books wasn't even part of our radar. I wasn't even part of our dream. But there we were, doing books. Connie's work and belief will always make my heart sing. She has no idea how she maintained the light in a state that is so riddled with racism and hate. This country owes her gratitude, respect, and appreciation. She has always been instrumental in my life as a friend and as a mentor. As I interviewed her the last time, I left feeling so sad because I knew I wasn't going to see her alive again. This was in 2012, I believe. And she was sad. She was losing her friends. She was sad her life was falling apart. She was sad her health was falling apart. She said, we're all different. When she talks about the book, about the women, we were all very different: Southern, Northern, rural, and urban, state universities, Ivy League, middle class, working class, and poor. We were moved to our radical activities in various ways: Marxism, Christianity, immigrant folks, wisdom by our grandmothers, and by the Constitution. Our book, I'm quoting Connie, Deep in Our Hearts, is about girls growing up in a revolutionary time and place. It is about love and politics and the transcendence of racial barriers. We offer this work to enrich the chronicle of a social movement that will forever change the country and our lives. I used to have this little piece, and I used to put it under my pillow at night when I was trying to get my first book published. And I would say it, I would read it out loud before I went to bed. And I was living in Morgantown, West Virginia, I believe then, yes. And so that stayed with me. It was always with me. These first-person accounts by white women activists represented a critical voice, yet one that had never been heard. This book breaks that silence, deep in our hearts, give us lens through which to view the politics of race and gender in the civil rights movement. And it probes the themes of growth, discovery, friendship, and courage. The real gift of these stories is a more optimistic legacy for a few generations of blacks and whites as they had navigated the path of racial relations into the 21st century, and hopefully take up the challenge that the 1960 activists did of trying to make the world a better place, a place more humane for all of us. Curry didn't have the typical Southern upbringing. Her parents, Ernest and Hazel Curry, were born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. They came to the U.S. and settled in Paterson, New Jersey, where Connie and her sister were born. The family moved to Greensboro, North Carolina soon afterwards. Connie calls Greensboro home. She started the 3rd grade there. She recalls her mother being very independent and an avid reader. She even paid Social Security for the African-American woman who worked as their housekeeper. Because of that, her mother didn't have any friends. The other white women resented her throwing their good money away on a maid. So Connie says this, "My parents were wonderful on every level with both my sister and me in terms of letting us be who we were and do what we wanted to do. They never encouraged anything about civil rights or the freedom movement or justice. They just encouraged us to be the best people that we could be." But segregation and injustice were clear in Greensboro, North Carolina. And having just come over from Ireland, they spent 3 or 4 years moving around, trying to find their way in this America. But they did not understand segregation. I think, I'm quoting Connie here, I think being a child of immigrants make the child more aware of the Bill of Rights and the Constitutions. You become more aware too because you grow up reading these documents. I always had the support of my family. I was always doing things out in the community, trying to make the world a more just place, and as she did. I don't think they understood half of it, she's speaking of her parents, but they always understood the bigger picture. Later, Connie realized how fortunate she was. A lot of the white women who had gotten involved in the movement were thrown out of their homes and families. And they never objected to her work, her family, for social justice since they believed in the same cause. Ireland was going to be a mess for years and years to come in the fight between the British and trying to control Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland trying to be free. That's what her father preached to her often, preached to not her, just her whole family. While going through her papers, Connie had come across something she had written titled The Easter Rebellion, which was the Irish Easter Rebellion. The poet Patrick Pearse was always on her mind at the end of her life in those early days at Agnes Scott. He warned, "Be aware, masters, when the people shall rise up." So I knew that Agnes Scott in Decatur, Georgia, had been a major influence on Connie's social and intellectual development. I wanted to know what that experience was like and how she ended up going to that college. She planned to go to a women's college she told me, and she knew about Agnes Scott from church, and a friend of hers was already attending. She applied, and she got a full scholarship. I was the Agnes Scott dream student, Connie said. Phi Beta Kappa, student body president, and a Fulbright scholar to France. So it wasn't like I was some kind of maverick, Connie remembered. I think Agnes Scott has always been a tradition of good professors. I couldn't call them liberal, but they certainly had an atmosphere of free thought, which we would probably call liberal today. Me, Ethel Smith, riding the MARTA bus in the 1970s, passing by Agnes Scott College every day, I thought it must be a dream place for intellectualism with the most beautiful campus I had ever seen. Later, I started taking evening classes there. They presented programs once a month called travelogues. Watching and learning about places far from America was the beginning of my travel bug. Connie attended Agnes Scott, and even though it was segregated, she said she loved her professors. She majored in English and history and had lots of friends. But what was more important, they tolerated me being involved with the National Student Association. They were one of the only white colleges that didn't drop out of the NSA after Brown versus the Board of Education, Connie said. In the beginning, Georgia Tech was involved with it, Emory University, all of the colleges around. But after Brown versus the Board of Education, they all dropped out. She has always felt fortunate that she grew up in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in a totally segregated society with all of the usual prejudice of Southern whites. She knew early and always asked the question, why? Why was there such a big gap between reality of what she saw around her and what she read about in the Constitution? What was I learning in church about God? All of the goodness of loving everybody, and then in my daily life, even as a child, I could see disparities between the word and the reality. Were you discriminated against because of being Irish, I asked? No, but we felt a lot of anti-Yankee sentiments. That hurt since we were from New Jersey. I remember my sister coming home from school saying somebody's mother said she didn't care if Jesus Christ himself was running for president. As long as he wasn't a Democrat, as long as he was a Democrat, they wouldn't vote for him. That was back before the great strangeness of the mix-up of Democrats and Republicans as we know it today. Connie said she had been thinking more about her Irish background. This is during the interview, the last time I saw her. And she was going through her papers, preparing to write her memoir. Even though we were from Northern Ireland, we were Northern Irish Protestant and considered part of the rebellion, my father left Ireland because of oppression. I have lived my whole life thinking about it and writing about it, and thinking about it and writing about it. And you sort of get it into your soul that oppression is oppression is oppression. I just love that when she said that. Curry learned early on that the English and the British Empire had tried to control and threat the Irish the same way. Lower class, not humans. She says, I remember the pigs in the parlor imagery. That is particularly true of Southern Ireland, but a lot of the prejudice, I didn't think my mother and father believed that. It was the manifestation of the beginning of the battle that made them leave in 1925. They knew it was going to be long and hard, and it was going to be a battle. How much of that seeped through me, I don't know. But it became clear that when I was in college in the 1950s, reading William Butler Yeats, Patrick Pearse, an Irish revolutionary, a lot of Irish radicals saying, "Beware when ye master, when the people rise up." I always equated that to slavery. Beware of the white masters, Connie said. The only difference, of course, is that we got slavery and the legacy of slavery to make the racism and the intolerance so much harder and even more complicated. My main concern today, Connie said, is about the schools to the prison pipeline. Connie believed that this is a resegregation of the public school system. The schools are absolutely terrible, and white people are still sending their children to private schools that are segregated. I was just talking to a friend of mine who was on the NAACP board at the Walnut Grove Prison, a juvenile detention privately owned in Mississippi outside of Jackson, where 13 to 19-year-olds occupied 600 beds, and they stayed full all the time. When the warden went on the board of directors and asked, didn't they have some kind of educational program, the warden said, "What do you want to educate them for? Half of them are going to be here for their life." These were 13-year-olds, 14-year-old children. We both cried when she told that story. Crayola Brown, my friend, this is Connie speaking, was there visiting, looking through the barbed wire fence when she felt something tugging at her shirt. It was an 11 or 12-year-old boy child. "You know, that's where I want to go. They get 3 hot meals and a cot in there, and they got books. And you're warm in the winter, and you're cool in the summer. Maybe you can help me get in." All I could think about was, is this what the civil rights movement was about? Connie said. It's just too heartbreaking. We both continued to cry. Connie's path to the resistance movement goes back to an incident when she was in the 4th grade in Greensboro, North Carolina, the lunch counter. She remembered this boy's name. She said, "I'll never forget it. His name was Douglas Gilly. He was standing next to me. He called one of the servants a nigger. I turned around to him and said, 'That woman is as good as your mother.' I learned quickly, you don't talk about folks' mama in the South." Anyhow, I had on a new raincoat. He pushed me in a puddle of mud at play period, even though I can still see the splattered mud on my new yellow coat, she recalled, and we laughed. Connie didn't have any direct contact with African Americans until 1951, when she was a student at Agnes Scott College. She had the opportunity to go to the National Congress, sponsored by the United States Student Association. A lot of Southern University were members, Emory, Georgia Tech, Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, all over the South. Delegations would send representatives up to the National Congress, which was always held in the middle of the U.S., so that it could draw from all over the country. At the age of 18, Connie Curry went to Ames, Iowa for the first National Student Congress meeting. They debated political questions. She found it interesting, but more interesting, that she had a black roommate from Xavier University in New Orleans. They got along well. And Agnes Scott, they didn't have any black students for a long time after Connie had been a student there. At the National Congress meeting, Connie met some delegates, and she started going to meetings. She would take a taxi to Spelman or Morehouse or wherever the meeting was. I had to get permission from my parents, my mother and my father, written permission, every time I went to an interracial meeting. Part of that was trying to protect the college. We're talking about integration, eating together, when segregation was the law of the land. My mother finally said, "Can't I just sign some blank permission slips? Do I have to write a new one every time?" But that was the way that it was So they did it. Connie was elected chair of the National Congress, but by that time, it was called the Great Southern Region. It stretched from Texas to Georgia, all the way across the South. After Brown versus the Board of Education, the Southern white colleges and universities stopped participating in the National Congress. I remember planning a meeting at the YMCA, known as the White Y, on Forsyth or Lucky Street downtown. We were allowed to have the meeting there, but we could not eat together. At lunchtime, when we came out, all the black students headed toward Auburn Avenue. That's when I began to realize that this wasn't only religious, intellectual, and historical, but that was the law, and that affected my life personally. It was against the law for me to eat with my friends. My passion and determination grew bigger, Connie told me. Curry remembers another defiance when she was working for the city of Atlanta as the director of human services. A young black man was accused of robbing a filling station. I think we call them service stations today. There were no eyewitnesses, and they didn't find anything on him. He said that he was jogging through the neighborhood and happened to cut through one of those filling stations. Something disappeared from the filling station, and he was arrested. Connie hung the jury by refusing to vote. She thought it was ridiculous that he was accused in the first place, but the all-white jury was willing to find him guilty because he was black. After I hung the jury, I thought I could do a better job by defending that young man. About the same time, she had seen an article in the newspaper about Woodrow Wilson's law school. It was at night. That's what motivated her to go to law school at 50. In the late 1970s, I remember riding the bus, passing through the lovely neighborhood around Agnes Scott. I often wondered who went to that college. That was long before I knew I would end up in a place like Hollins College, a similar place. I remember thinking how wonderful it was that Connie went to law school at age 40, is what I thought at the time. Later, when I was talking to her about it, she said, I was 50. Maybe I could change my life too. That was Ethel talking. It was the 1980s. I had worked as an investigator for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I had worked at Xerox in marketing. But neither was fulfilling in a way. At age 37, I applied and was awarded a full fellowship to Hollins College to study creative writing. Hollins, like Agnes Scott, is very Southern, all female, with the exception of the very small graduate program, mostly white, and a campus so stunning, photographs can't do it justice. At Hollins, I felt like I had been transported in some Gone with the Wind world. On the front porch was like 20 rocking chairs. So instead of practicing law, I go in and out with my stories, so I have to keep up with them. Instead of practicing law, Connie Curry used her law degree to get into the prison system to interview inmates and write about their experiences. She loved law school as she loved high school and college. Studying gave her a better idea about the world that she lived in. She even loved being 50 and being in law school. She was sure that the students referred to her as the old lady. But that changed. One day in her Constitution law class, they were discussing a case, Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. The Supreme Court had ruled on December 14, 1964, that in passing Title II in the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited segregation or discrimination in places of public accommodation, involved interstate commerce. The important case presented an immediate challenge to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Much of the 100 years preceding 1964, race relations in the United States have been dominated by the system of racial segregation. That, while in name, provided for separate but equal treatment of both black and white Americans, this perpetuated inferior accommodations, services, and treatment of black American citizens. The Heart of Atlanta Motel, a large hotel in Midtown Atlanta, was in violation of the terms of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because it did not allow African Americans to check into the motel. The owner filed a lawsuit in federal court arguing that the requirement of the act exceeded the authority granted to Congress over interstate commerce. He maintained that it violated his Fifth Amendment to choose customers and operate his business as he wished, and resulted in unjust of his property without due process of the law and just compensation. Finally, he contended that Congress had placed him in a position of involuntary servitude by forcing him to rent available space to blacks, therefore violating his 13th Amendment rights. The United States countered that restriction, requiring adequate accommodation for black Americans were unquestionably related to the interstate travel, and that Congress, under the Constitution's Commerce Clause, had the power to address such a matter in law. It further argued that the Fifth Amendment does not forbid reasonable regulations of interstate commerce, and it asserted that the 13th Amendment applied primarily to slavery and the removal of widespread disabilities associated with it. The U.S. District Court for Northern Georgia issued a permanent injunction requiring the motel to stop discriminating based on race. In 1964, the hotel closed. When Connie Curry told her classmates that she was close friends and part of the group that helped to make that law possible, she said, "They began to look at me differently." She was sure they stopped calling her that old lady. She went on to pass the Georgia bar with no problem. Not only after passing the bar, Connie took an early retirement from city government for a fellowship at the Carter Woodson Center in Charlottesville, Virginia. She had access to detailed Mississippi notes, her notes from Mississippi, and she spent a year interviewing all 13 of the Carter children. She interviewed the mayor of Atlanta and lots of other government officials. I just had so much, and the blessings kept coming. I also had a New York agent. So when she said that, we screamed out loud, because it used to be in the South, it was unheard of having a New York agent. Now that's a blessing for a Southerner to get a New York agent, I said. What's weird was when I was up in Virginia, I wrote an article for the Virginia Quarterly Review about this family. I didn't know literary agents read literary magazines. He contacted me and said, "If you ever want to write a book, call me." Is that unbelievable? Unbelievable and so wonderful, I agreed. There were so many rejections, and all of a sudden, Algonquin said, "We want your book." Shannon Ravenel, graduate of Hollins College, taught me so much about writing from the very beginning. Connie's life doesn't always have to be, Connie, she said to her, you don't have to write in chronological order. So for the first line in Civil Rights is to go back to my own roots. Civil Rights is an important book of its era. It was awarded the Lillian Smith Prize for Nonfiction in 1996. The book was also a finalist for the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, and it was recommended by the New York Times for summer reading and was named the outstanding book on the subject of human rights in North America. From the depth of slavery and the civil rights movement came many broken families and hearts, broken bodies, unforgettable, painful memories. Connie Curry portrays a family caught in the middle of a struggle for freedom of choice. Civil rights icon Vernon Jordan said about the book, "We sometimes forget what prices were paid to defeat desegregation in the Mississippi Delta and what courage it took." This book reminds us all of this moving account of the Carter family. It's an important document and an inspiring story. The Carter family put themselves on the line from the time May Bertha signed the Freedom of Choice papers for the 4 younger children. The older children, Larry, Stanley, and Ruth, signed for themselves. In addition to her education at Agnes Scott and the Woodrow Wilson Law School, Connie did graduate work in political science at Columbia University and was a Fulbright scholar, like me, at the University of Bordeaux in France, except she did it first. She was also awarded fellowships from the Institute for Women's Studies at Emory University, and I mentioned the Carter G. Wilson at the University of Virginia. Connie Curry credits an important part of her education and experience to civil rights activist and icon Ella Baker. I remember specifically Ella's speech because her whole talk was called "More Than a Hamburger." She warned that work was just beginning. Integrating lunch counters was one thing. Breaking down barriers in areas as racially and culturally entrenched as voting rights, education, and the workplace was going to be much tougher than we could ever imagine. And she further warned, don't let anyone escape, especially the old folks, tell you what to do. This is Ella Baker talking to the young people, because the old people had grown up in a different era, and they were afraid, and they weren't interested in change. They were afraid. So, she was such an eloquent and powerful speaker. The impact of that speech hit spirit, and I began to realize that the sit-ins were more than the movement, and it was beginning to be much more than a demand for something to eat at a lunch counter. I was so overwhelmed at the breadth of the representation there. Ella Baker said, "Give light and people will find a way." Constance Curry has also maintained that light. Thank you very much.
Do you want to show the image of Connie Curry? I don't think we ever got
Oh,
it
I'm
up
supposed
on
to do that.
Well, that's all right. It's,
Oh, okay.
one there, and that's the
That's,
jacket.
this is the jacket to the book that you're going to buy later on. This is Connie, beloved Connie. And you know what I should have done? In the book, I have the photographer who took that picture, and he's very well known. I can't call his name now, but you have to buy the book, and then you'll know.
We have copies of the book. We have gone a little over, so we won't have time for
I'm
questions
sorry.
today. No, it's great. It's great. It's wonderful. Thank you all for being here. We do have copies of the book, and any questions that you did have, I was about to say, Dr. Smith would be glad to answer those questions over here. Don't forget about the movie screening here tomorrow. Free admission to the museums Friday for Brother Heck's birthday. And then I hope that we'll see you next week for Jim Woodrick's History's Lunch. Help me thank Ethel Morgan Smith for this fabulous program.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I didn't mean to go over, but I'll be over here, and then I'll talk to anyone who will talk to me. How's that? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go over.